man stands on a wooden pier in Sausalito at dawn, a cup of tea cooling between his fingers. Fog drifts across the bay like a living thing, swallowing the coastline in silence. He stares into it not as if looking through the mist, but as if listening to it. Then he smiles, a soft, mischievous smile, the kind a man makes when he knows a secret the rest of the world has forgotten. That man was Alan Watts, and almost nobody knew the full story. Many people remember Watts as the velvet-voiced philosopher who intoxicated the West with Zen, but few know that before he captured the world with cosmic metaphors, he was a restless, sickly English boy who kept over 150 notebooks by the age of 14, filled not with homework or doodles, but with hand-drawn mandalas, Buddhist aphorisms, and coded spiritual observations. Teachers thought he was eccentric. Watts thought he was preparing for something. He once said, "I study the pattern behind patterns." Rarely did people realize he meant it literally. The boy who didn't believe in reality, young Alan had a habit that unnerved adults. He asked questions that made them uncomfortable, not rebellious questions, existential ones. At age 7, he asked a priest, "How can I be punished forever for sins committed in such a tiny life?" The priest said discipline would answer that. Watts said logic would. But the first rare fact emerges here. Watts nearly became a Christian monk. He was accepted as a postulant in an Anglican monastery at 16, but was quietly removed after only months because the elders believed he was too intellectually undisciplined and dangerously imaginative. That same monastery ironically would later invite him back as a guest lecturer once he became famous. The Forbidden Library. Watts' spiritual shift began not with Buddhism, but with a scandal. As a teenager, he volunteered at a small London church that, unbeknownst to most, hid a contraband bookshelf works banned or discouraged by clergy. Alan devoured them in secret, Nietzsche, Blavatsky, Krishnamurti. But the turning point came when he discovered a 400-page Japanese art catalog, filled with Zen paintings. A scythe book hit him with the force of an aesthetic lightning strike. This was a rare fact too. Watts' first exposure to Zen was not through philosophy but through the emptiness of a Sumi landscape felt like truth spoken without words. This event would shape his life more than any scripture ever could. An outsider everywhere. As he drifted toward Eastern thought, Alan discovered another odd talent. He could imitate accents flawlessly. Londoners thought he was upper. Americans later thought he was British aristocracy. Japanese monks claimed he must have been a poet in a former life. But behind the charm was loneliness. His parents lived separately under the same roof, silent and cold. He once said the emotional distance in his home taught him that the world is a theater and everyone acts kindness before learning to feel it. Rare fact 3. Watts developed his signature speaking style as a defense mechanism, crafting a warm, hypnotic tone to counteract the emotional stillness of his childhood home. It became his greatest tool, crossing the ocean of identity. At 23, Watts married his first wife, Eleanor, and boarded a ship to America with less than $100. He spent the voyage writing and seasick. Very seasick. Took no teas, but Watts had chronic motion sickness his entire life. Even though he was often photographed on boats, he traveled anyway. The ocean, he felt, mirrored consciousness. Vast, unpredictable, transformative. Upon reaching New York, he did something surprising. He enrolled in seminary. Rare fact 4. Watts was ordained as an Episcopal priest in his 20s. Rare fact 5. He performed baptisms and funerals while secretly wrestling with whether the soul even existed. This inner conflict simmered until it finally broke. The scandal that set him free in 1950, after years of tension with church leadership who found him too unorthodox, too mystical, too questioning, Watts resigned the priesthood. But the real spark came from something rarely discussed. Fact 6. Watts was reprimanded for preaching about Buddhism during Christian sermons, not critically, but admiringly. Congregants complained that he spoke of Buddha like he was an uncle who lived next door. This was the moment the West gained its most charismatic ambassador of Eastern wisdom. A pilgrim in a suit and tie, Watts moved to San Francisco. But he didn't shave his head or wear robes. He walked into Zen temples in a tweed jacket, pipe in hand, quoting Shakespeare. Some monks disliked it. Others adored him, but almost all agreed he possessed something rare. A mind that translated ancient concepts into vivid, modern language. Rare fact 7. Watts was never officially a Zen monk, but he taught Zen monks how to explain Zen to Westerners. And the only paradox. Hebel, scholar. Despite being labeled a scholar, Watts never earned a traditional academic degree beyond his seminary training. Fact 8. He self-educated by reading more than 10,000 books across religion, art, psychology, botany, poetry, and physics. His personal library grew so enormous that he had to keep parts of it in neighbors' basements. Still, he was invited to lecture at Harvard, Princeton, and Oxford without a PhD. A rarity in academia. The radio mystic in the mid-1950s, San Francisco radio producers discovered Watts' voice almost by accident. A friend recorded one of his talks on a primitive wire recorder. The studio was stunned. People said listening to him felt like having your mind massaged. Rare fact 9. Watts' first radio broadcast aired at 2 a.m. and still became the most requested rebroadcast of the year. Overnight, a philosopher became a cultural phenomenon. The man who lived on a houseboat, Watts bought a houseboat in Sausalito, not for the aesthetic, but because he wanted a home that swayed with the eternal pulse. Rare fact 10. He named the boat Valhalla, not after Norse mythology, but because he believed the word sounded like the laughter of the gods. He wrote some of his most famous books on that floating sanctuary, often while sipping tea mixed with whiskey, surrounded by foghorns and gulls. And it was here, on the deck of Valhalla, that Watts began crafting the ideas that would define him. The illusion of the separate self, the cosmic dance of being. Most listeners never knew these insights emerged from a man who, by his own admission, spent years battling self-doubt and imposter syndrome. A small meditation hall in Marin County. A candle flickers, wind presses against the wooden walls. Alan Watts sits cross-legged before a dozen students. His eyes are half-closed, his voice low and warm. He asks them to listen not to him, but to the space around his words. Then he stops speaking. The silence grows thick, uncomfortably electric. Someone finally coughs. Watts opens one eye, amused, and whispers, "That discomfort you feel is the doorway. Enter it." They didn't know this silence came from a man wrestling with the very things he taught them to release. The public sage, the private storm by the 1960s. Alan Watts had become the West's unofficial gatekeeper of Eastern wisdom. His lectures were overflowing. His books spread across campuses like underground scripture. His voice rich, playful, hypnotic became the soundtrack of a spiritual revolution. But privately, Watts was falling apart. Here comes rare fact 11. Watts suffered from long stretches of creative anxiety so severe he would sometimes rewrite a single page 50 times, only to throw it away in frustration. He once admitted to a friend that he feared he was merely performing enlightenment, not living Italiano. The paradox tortured him. He taught millions how to dissolve the ego while struggling to escape his own. The quiet scandal. Many know Watts loved Scotch. Few know the depth of it. Rare fact 12. Watts kept a hidden compartment on his Sausalito houseboat stocked with high-proof Japanese whiskey given to him by Zen monks, a gift he cherished and later relied on at the peak of his fame. He was drinking enough that close friends feared he wouldn't survive the decade, but he insisted the alcohol wasn't an escape. It was, in his words, a loosening of the rigid self. Even so, the strain showed. The weight of fame showed. The knowing doubt showed. His marriages suffered, friendships strained. And yet, the more his private world trembled, the more profound his public insights became. The counterculture's accidental guru, rare fact 13. Watts never intended to become a counterculture icon. He didn't seek it, didn't cultivate it. He simply lectured, wrote, and thought. Deeply and Suddenly, thousands of young people were treating him like a spiritual rock star. He joked that he had accidentally become a guru without the talent for celibacy or seriousness. Still, his influence was enormous. He advised artists, scientists, musicians, even the Beatles listened to the recordings of his talks. At one gathering, a young poet asked him, "What should we do with all the suffering in the world?" Watts sipped his tea, smiled, and replied, "Don't carry the ocean in a cup." A master of the unlikely connection, one reason Watts captivated listeners was his ability to connect ideas that never shared a room or a century. Rare fact, 14. Watts studied quantum physics in private for years, not to become a scientist, but to understand the deep metaphors hidden within wave functions and probability clouds. He sensed that physics and mysticism were two dancers performing the same choreography in different languages. He once told a physicist, "You study the behavior of particles. I study the behavior of consciousness. But both of us are staring at an illusion that pretends to be solid." The physicist reportedly walked away, stunned. The Zen teacher, who never claimed to be one. Watts had a peculiar relationship with Zen monks. Half mentorship, half mischief. Rare facts 15. He often pranked Zen students by giving them intentionally impossible cones just to watch their egos collapse. One cone he invented was, "Describe the sound of a shadow." Another, "What is the shape of the space behind your thoughts?" Students would struggle for hours. Watts would chuckle warmly and explain that the point wasn't the answer, it was the surrender. His laughter, ironically, taught more than his words. The 3-day experiment, rare fact 16. Watts once conducted a private consciousness fasting experiment, isolating himself for 3 days on the houseboat with no speaking, no reading, no writing, not even meditation. Only presence. On the final night, he described feeling as if he were disappearing into the fabric of the fog. This experience led directly to one of his most famous ideas. The ego is not a thing, but a pattern that repeats itself until you notice it. He claimed the experiment broke that pattern for him, at least for a moment. The turning point in the mountains, but the true turning point wasn't the fog. It was the mountains. Rare fact, 17. Watts almost became a full-time hermit. In the early 60s, overwhelmed by fame and failing relationships, he retreated to a cabin near Mount Tamalpais. He considered giving up lecturing entirely, living quietly, and writing only for himself. For several months he lived in silence and solitude, walking the mountain trails, watching deer at dawn, listening to wind sweep through the pines. Here, something unexpected happened. The isolation didn't soothe him, it sharpened him. He wrote in a private notebook, "Solitude reveals the self in terrifying detail. But I must return. The world is my mirror, not these mountains." He went back to teaching with renewed ferocity. The day he challenged everything. In 1965, Watts delivered a lecture now considered legendary. Students packed the hall, expecting a talk on Zen. Instead, Watts calmly dismantled all spiritual systems, Eastern, Western, ancient, modern. Rare fact 18. Watts privately called this the lecture that might end my career. Instead, it became one of the most requested recordings in the history of Pacifica radio. His message was simple, yet explosive. No philosophy, no religion, no scripture will ever save you. Because the one asking for salvation is the very illusion these systems reveal. People gasped, some walked out. Most Dadan broke open. The teacher, who admitted he was, lost another rare truth. Fact 19. Watts was one of the few spiritual figures who openly admitted uncertainty. In private letters, he confessed to friends that he didn't believe anyone, monks, gurus, scholars truly understood the universe. He felt the wisest thing one could do was dance with the mystery. This humility is what made him powerful. He was not a gatekeeper of enlightenment. He was a companion on the road, and the students loved him for it. The hidden philosophy behind his laughter. People always mention Alan Watts, laugh light, mischievous, childlike. But few know its origin. Rare fact 20. Watts learned his iconic laugh from a Zen master in New York, who taught him that the sound of spontaneous laughter was the echo of the universe recognizing itself. Watts took this to heart. He insisted that enlightenment wasn't salamite, was playful. Onsi. The universe is playing hide and seek with itself. When you laugh, you've found it. The cracks begin to show by the end of the decade. Watts was everywhere. Radio, books, colleges, conferences, spiritual gatherings. But fame brought exhaustion. Travel, drinking, teaching, writing, it all began to blur. He was chasing deadlines, expectations, and the image of Alan Watts that fans demanded. The same man who taught millions to let go found himself clinging to an identity the world had painted for him. The tension grew. The strain deepened, and the houseboat in Sausalito remained the only place where he felt truly weightless. But a storm was coming, one that would change everything. It begins at dusk. The sky over Mount Tamalpais is turning amber, then violet, then a deep, ancient blue. The wind moves through the trees like a memory trying to speak. Alan Watts is walking along a narrow trail, hands folded behind his back, pipe resting between his fingers. He pauses, listens not to the forest, but to something deeper, something pulling from within. He whispers to no one. All that we perceive is the playing of the universe, and I am one of its gestures. He smiles, but in that smile, there is both illumination and the first shadow of farewell. The fragmenting mirror by the early 1970s, Watts had become everywhere and nowhere at once, a cultural paradox. Colleges, commune gatherings, Zen centers, European lecture halls, radio studios. Everyone wanted the man who could turn cosmic ideas into liquid poetry. But the more the world reached for him, the more thinly he was stretched. His closest friends noticed something quietly heartbreaking. Watts' brilliance was peaking at the exact moment his body was failing him. The endless travel, the late-night writing frenzies, the drinking, the pressure to be Alan Watts. It all piled onto a frame already fragile since childhood. He once told a student backstage, "Enlightenment taught me to dance with suffering, but sometimes it steps on my toes." He laughed, but he was tired. So tired. The secret he never spoke about in public. There is a small detail rarely mentioned in biographies, one that reveals more about Watts than any of his grand ideas. In the final years of his life, he carried in his pocket a tiny, worn brass compass. Not for navigation, not for symbolism, but because rare fact 21, he used it as a silent reminder that direction itself is an illusion. He would flick it open in quiet moments, watch the needle spin, and whisper, wherever it points, "That's where I already am." This became his private meditation. The return to the mountain, though forever associated with the Sausalito houseboat, it was Mount Tamalpais that claimed his final years. The mountain had become, in a sense, his teacher. He rented a cabin near its slopes, a humble refuge where he could rest, write, and recover from the accelerating demands of his public life. But here's the hidden truth. Rare fact 22, Watts wrote some of his clearest, most radical ideas while in physical pain, often lying on the cabin floor, notebook tilted against a pillow, scotch within reach, fog drifting through the open window. The serenity listeners heard in his voice on recordings often came from a man writing through discomfort so deep it forced him inward, into the marrow of his insights. He never let the public see that. The night of the lantern, a story is told, one whispered by a friend who visited him during those final months. One night, Watts walked outside, holding a paper lantern. He set it on the ground, sat beside Italiano, and watched the flame flicker inside the fragile shell. The friend asked, "What are you doing out here alone?" Watts said, "I'm observing the relationship between illumination and fragility." The friend frowned. "You mean the lantern?" Watts smiled softly. "No. I mean us." This moment was the seed of a line he later wrote. "To be human is to be a flame that knows its ways." Rare fact 23. That entire passage in his notebook was inspired by a single lantern trembling in the wind. The teacher becomes the lesson. As the years pressed on, Watts' philosophies grew sharper, almost prophetic. He leaned more heavily into the idea that the universe was a self-playing game. Consciousness was a performance, an ego was a costume worn for a brief cosmic scene. But here lies rare fact 24. Watts feared he had miscommunicated one thing. He never intended for people to escape the ego, but to play with it. He told a student, "The problem isn't that you believe you exist. The problem is that you take your costume too seriously." This would have been the thesis of a book he never finished. The last lecture he ever gave in late 1973, Watts delivered what would be his final public talk. The audience had no idea. Neither did he. He stood before the crowd, looking both weary and luminous, and said something that silenced the room. "You are an aperture through which the universe looks at itself, and what you see depends on how clearly you look." Those were some of the last recorded words of his public teaching life. Rare fact 25. He improvised that entire lecture with no notes. It remains one of his most haunting. The final night on the mountain here, the story becomes quiet, painfully quiet. In November 1973, Watts returned to his cabin near the mountain. A lit a fire, he poured a small drink. He opened a notebook, but wrote only a few scattered words before closing it again. He laid down, closed his eyes, and the play of the universe moved on without him. He was 58. Rare fact 26. On the last page of his notebook was a single unfinished sentence. "The world is—" He never completed it. The ink stopped mid-stroke. It remains one of the most poignant artifacts of his life. The legacy that refused to die in the years after his passing. Something surprising happened. Watts did not fade. Recordings resurfaced. Unpublished manuscripts were found. New generations discovered his voice on tapes, on campus libraries, in underground circles, later on the internet, then everywhere. Rare fact 27. Watts has influenced more listeners in the decades after his death than during his lifetime. His voice travels further now than it ever did when he was alive. It is as if the man who spent his life teaching the illusion of separateness somehow dissolved into the collective mind after death, exactly as he predicted. Why he still matters. People often say they find comfort in Watts' lectures because his voice feels like home. But the deeper truth is this. He spoke to the part of us that instinctively that reality is not what it seems, that consciousness is playful, that identity is fluid, and that existence is something more like a cosmic improvisation. He didn't tell us what to believe. He reminded us how to see. The closing circle. So now, imagine returning to that misty pier in Sausalito, the one from the beginning. The fog drifts, the sea murmurs, the sky glows faintly with dawn. Alan Watts stands there ageless, amused, listening to the silence between waves. He turns to you with that soft, mischievous smile and says, "You are the universe experiencing itself. Don't forget to enjoy the show." And the fog swallows him, but not the voice. Never the voice.